I'd like to introduce Tabitha Edith Lee from Carnegie Mellon University. Tabitha is a PhD candidate in robotics at CMU's Robotics Institute. She is a member of the Intelligent Autonomous Manipulation Lab and is advised by Professor Oliver Kroemer. Her thesis research investigates causal robot learning for manipulation, the interplay between robot perception and control through the lens of causality to learn and leverage the causal structure of manipulation tasks. Her research in structural sim-to-real transfer has been recognized by an honorable mention selection for the NCWIT Collegiate Award. She's also a Siebel Scholar in computer science. Thanks for joining us today, Tabitha, and I'm excited to hear about your research soon.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Nitin. It is my absolute pleasure to be here today and to talk about our work in scale. And I did want to also give a huge shout out to the entire Talking Robotics team, Nitin, Reedy, Suraj, and Sylvia for all that you do with organizing this seminar series. Again, and I'm quite grateful to be a part of Talking Robotics. So the overview for my talk today, to give you more meta context, an earlier version of my talk included more information about causality, introducing some concepts, talking about open world manipulation. For the purposes of the talk, I decided to focus almost entirely on scale, our algorithm. So if there is time at the end, I would love to revisit this this topic because it would be great to not only have opportunity to answer questions, but also have a discussion and a conversation about causality, because potentially for many of you joining, this may be the first approach you've seen involving causal learning. So to go ahead and jump right in, this talk will talk about our approach SCALE, which stands for Skills from Causal Learning. So this work was recently accepted and shared at the most recent conference on robot learning in 2023 in Atlanta. I want to give a huge shout out to my co-authors and collaborators, Shivam, Sid, and Oliver. This was a team effort, and we were so happy about the outcome of this paper. And in particular, I want to emphasize the contributions of Shivam. Shivam is co-first author on this work, and we are fortunate to also have Shivam on the call today as well, and happy to get his expertise during the discussion period in terms of this work, and then how it connects with other fields in the robotics fields. So the overall motivation for my research and my thesis research, which SCALE is a part of, is this idea of having robot manipulation being able to be deployed and successfully used in the open world. And by the open world, I'm specifically referring to kitchens, restaurants, hospitals, public places. For example, this kitchen that you see here. And my goal is I'd love to be able to go to the robot store, buy a robot, and then put it into my kitchen so that this way it can be able to perform useful automation work. So my kitchen is not as nice as the one shown here, but suffice it to say, let's consider this robot operating in this kitchen with many objects and object percepts. One potential task that we might want the robot to complete is to open the cabinet and open the salsa jar that's in the cabinet. Now, there are many different ways to solve this particular problem. You could use deep representation learning. What I want to emphasize is three perspectives that help steer us towards the framework of interest for this problem. The first perspective that I want to note is that oftentimes long horizon tasks can be decomposed into smaller tasks. So this long horizon task of open the cabinet and open the salsa jar can be, in this case, decomposed into smaller tasks. First, we want the robot to open the cabinet, and then we want the robot to open the salsa jar. Another perspective here is that only selective parts of the environment matter for particular task solutions. So for the case of opening the cabinet, potentially all the robot needs to consider are properties of the cabinet. So where it's located, the position of the handle, the angle of the door, whether it's open or not. Similarly, for opening the salsa jar, the robot may consider properties such as position, where it is in the shelf, the diameter of the jar, and how tall it is. And note that in order to, say, open the cabinet, it isn't necessary to consider certain other properties in this kitchen. For example, what the kettle is doing on the stove or the apples that are on the table probably aren't important for the smaller task of just opening the cabinet. The third perspective here is that different task solutions can be reused. So there is value in having a diversity of task solutions because the robot can then use these different task solutions for different downstream tasks. And so what this motivates is a framework that we look into in this paper that our work goes towards, which is that of skill learning. And indeed, what we then want the robot to be able to learn is a skill to solve each of these tasks. For example, we would have a skill to open the cabinet, and then we would have a skill to open the jar. So after we do this, we could be done with the problem. We can open the cabinet and the salsa jar, no problem. But it may also be useful to learn different solutions for the same task. And in the case of the jar, let us assume that we may have access to a cloth on the countertop here. And so the robot could potentially also learn a second way of opening the jar, which is to open a jar with the cloth. And this may be useful if the jar is sometimes very is loose or the jar is very tight. Potentially one of these skills could be more useful than the other. This may also be useful if we want to do another, we want the robot to complete another task after training time, which is to say we want the robot to be able to now open this jar of olives that's in the fridge. Potentially the robot could use these skills from jar opening for this other task, either zero shot or with some fine tuning. Now, I also want to provide a second example for the skill learning problem. In fact, I want to do a shout out and a throwback to 2 weeks ago for Talking Robotics number 70, where we had Tapo from Cornell University talking about his great work in assistive technologies for people with mobility disabilities and limitations. And one of these technologies was an arm that can automatically skewer food and then help transfer that food into someone's mouth. So to give you another example of potentially how this could be framed in a skill learning problem, the task here the robot would want to be able to complete is to skewer a piece of food on a plate with a fork. For example, the plate that you see here. And what we learned from Tapo 2 weeks ago is that depending on the features of the food, for example, here a carrot, depending on where it is on the plate and the presence of other food, this may motivate different strategies for skewering this item. So whether the carrot is isolated in the middle of the plate, or it is close to a wall. So if it's next to a wall, potentially the robot could use the wall to help localize the fork with the item. And as the third case, if the carrot here is stacked on more food, this would require potentially a third strategy. So one way to also looking at this particular problem of solving these tasks is also through skill learning, where the robot could potentially learn a skill for each of these skewering strategies, whether the food is isolated, against the wall, or stacked. Now, I want to just make clear, this is not necessarily a better way of doing the problem. I just wanted to provide this example to sort of ground this idea of skill learning and also reference Tapo's great work in this area. So the key insight for our paper in Scale is that we want to define a skill by the properties that are causally relevant for it. And by properties throughout this talk, we're going to be using representations in terms of variables, causal variables. So if our robot here is able to learn 3 different skills, what this might look like for each skill is that, for example, the input to the skill policy, if there are 5 potential variables the robot knows about, it will know that for this particular skill, that only the green variables are needed for input to the policy. And we want these variables that are causally relevant for the skill, and more precisely, we find these through causal interventions. Now, how exactly do we do this? So the TLDR of scale is the following. It's an algorithm with 3 steps. The first is that we're going to generate a batch data set, and that batch data set includes the relevant variables that are learned from causal interventions. Then the next step is we're going to be grouping together within the batch data set. We're going to be grouping subgroups of data sets by their relevant variables. And each of these subgroups are going to be a data set for a particular skill. Then the third step is we're going to be training a skill for each of these smaller skill data sets. Now, before I jump into the algorithm and do a deep dive there, I do want to provide some preliminaries to help ground the problem. So for more preliminaries in skill learning, we are learning skills, and in particular parameterized options. And what we refer to this in the paper as regional compressed options. And these consist of 4 components. The first is the policy for the option, which is the action the robot would take. And we're going to assume that the option policy can be decomposed into a high-level, low-level policy. And I will have a slide in about 2 slides that talk about this a little bit more. The second component of the skill is a precondition. And so this is a probabilistic initiation set. It is supposed to capture, based on where the robot is in the world, how likely it is to able to solve the task starting from that position in state space. The third component is a termination condition, which refers to how the duration of the skill and when do you stop applying the skill policy. For our particular work, though, we are only considering fixed time rollouts. But in principle, the approach could be augmented with more specificity there. And the fourth component is one that is new to our work. It is the data generating region. So I'm going to say what it is and then give some intuition here. So the data generating region, or DGR, is a region that captures the data generating process and provides training data for policy learning. If you're not familiar with this terminology, data generating process, let me try to explain. So this is terminology that's used in the causality literature. It is basically a phrase that captures the underlying process, physical process from which the data is generated. So the idea here intuitively is to not think of data as, say, like a static data set, but this data is actually generated by some process. And in fact, the data then becomes the sort of the outcome of that data generating process. So this illustration on the right shows the 4 different components. So we have a robot here indicated by this icon here. And in this position in what we call in this work context space, which you can think of a context space is the generalization of state space that includes time invariant features. But the robot could, from this position, take action based on the option policy that would land it into the goal space. And because this action is available that can solve the task, then we have a region of high precondition surrounding this area. And similarly, a region here, the DGR, that captures that this is where that causal process is, where if the robot can execute this action, it'll solve the task. Another important aspect of our work is that some of these components are only going to be using causally relevant variables. So this is true for the option policy. We only use certain variables as input, and also true for the data generating region. And when I will refer to these particular variable sets, I will refer to them either as the set A for the policy or the set D for the DGR. To contextualize our work in the broader skill learning literature, there are 3 areas that I want to highlight. The first is in learning parameterized skills. And emblematic of this type of work is the work of De Silva, where they looked at learning a lower dimensional manifold that relates how policy parameters change as task parameters, or context in our case, change as well. So in their approaches that they are using isomap to learning that low dimension manifold, You could think of our approach as also having dimensionality reduction, but this is provided by causal interventions. Another related area of work is that of differentiable methods for providing either attention or abstraction to the context for each skill. So our work also relates to this idea of attention. You can think of it more as an explicit form of attention based on the variables that are identified as relevant. And as a result of this explicit attention, our skills are also quite interpretable because they're defined by these variables. The third grouping of work is that relating to unsupervised skill discovery. And this is a quite broad area of literature. We've just provided two example categories here. One is in information theoretic methods, other is in graph-based methods. You could think of our approach as a causal-based method that is going to be discovering skills by grouping together similar results from causal intervention. So in the previous slide, I talked about the policy and that we require a high-level, low-level decomposition. I want to talk about that a little bit more in this slide. So the actual policy the robot will be learning for the skill, we're assuming can be decomposed into two parts. One is a lower level policy, which concerns robot actuation, and also an upper level policy whose role is to generalize the low level policy. We're going to be assuming that we are given the low level policy that can be parameterized by certain parameters. Here we use the symbol theta. And an example of such a lower level policy would be, for example, a trajectory generator where the shape of the trajectory can be defined by certain parameters to shape where the trajectory goes. For the part of the policy that the robot will be learning is an upper level policy. And the upper level policy takes as input the context vector. These are the properties I talked about earlier in the motivation. And the output of this policy is going to be parameters for the low level policy. And you can think of the inputs here as essentially like the features of the policy. And to walk you through this diagram on the right, starting from some initial scene, some initial context, this is provided to the upper level policy as input, which outputs low level parameters theta for the lower level policy. Then throughout the episode, the robot is interacting with the world through this low level policy. So it takes action and receives from the environment a new state and reward. And this continues until the end of the trajectory, where then finally we get a final episode reward. Note also that only a few of the context variables may be relevant for this particular policy. And as mentioned before, we're going to indicate the variables that are relevant for the policy by this variable set A. And the flow chart on the right still applies. Instead of just using the regular C as the context space, we're actually going to use this notation here that represents it's a compressed context. So if our full context is maybe 10-dimensional, the compressed context would be maybe 3-dimensional, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about the simulator that we use for this work. So we leverage a simulator that has certain properties to it. It is the case that any simulator off the shelf won't necessarily work. There are certain properties that we need to do causal reasoning. So in particular, we're requiring that we have access to a simulator that implements two important modules. The first is a way to create a scene. And then the second is the transition function, which provides the forward flow of dynamics. And for the scenes that are constructed, we are assuming that they can be created from a particular context vector and a list of interventions. And the next slide, I will show an example of this. We're also going to be considering scenes only in which the task is feasible. So we don't consider cases where there are objects intersecting each other, for example. And very importantly, I will talk about this at the end of the talk, but we are assuming that the context space representation admits causal interventions. And what this generally means is that we're going to be assuming the context space that we have is disentangled. For an example, a disentangled space in 3 dimensions would be, X position, Y position, Z position. This would be disentangled in 3 dimensions. This slide provides more example about the context interventions. So let's assume the robot has this particular simulator or this in particular scene to create. And in this example, let us assume that the context space here is represented by the position, height, and red color of each of these two blocks, blocks A and block B. So we can instantiate this particular scene based on this vector representation. That from this vector representation, the simulator can create a particular scene. So an example of what an intervention might look like, we're going to be using the do operator introduced by Pearl, and we're going to be setting the value of a particular position to be a certain value. So if we conduct this intervention, say we want the block A position to now be equal to 1, you can compare the figure on the left and the figure on the right here to show that, okay, everything else in the world is the same, except now we have this intervention that has happened, and now the environment is a little bit different. I want to emphasize that when we talk about interventions in the simulator, the robot isn't physically moving the block, say from 0 to 1 in this case. It is, with this intervention, creating this new scene that now has this different property. So to continue the example, we now have intervention, for example, on the block B position height. And so now you can see under this intervention, the block height is doubled. And to close the example, we have the intervention on block B's red color. And now we see it's become a little bit darker. So now it's a dark red. Okay, next part of my talk is going to be doing a deep dive into the scale algorithm. And to provide visualizations and intuition for this part, I'm going to be describing how this works with a toy example in a block stacking domain that we talk about in the appendix of the paper. So to give you an overview of this toy example, let us assume that we have a block stacking task where the goal of the robot is to stack the red block on top of the green block. And let us assume that there's only 2 variations of context variables that could possibly change in this example. The first is the height of the target block, and then the second is the height of the obstructing block. Furthermore, we're going to assume that the robot has access to this following low-level controller, where with certain parameters theta, the robot can lift the block up and over and then down on top of the target block. And to work backwards from the final example, as a result of scale, this particular problem can be decomposed into 2 particular parts, and each part has its own skill. So you can think of this problem when the target block is taller than the obstructing block, which is this illustration on the right here. All the robot needs to do is lift the source block up and over. Here, the obstructing block isn't necessary for solving this particular task. However, when the obstructing block is taller, now it is the case the robot must take this into account. And now the robot has to lift the source block up and over to clear the obstructing block, and then down onto the target block. So in this particular problem, note that there are 2 essentially modes of the data here, 2 families of policies, and each of these can be learned by scale. And how exactly we do this is through the following algorithm. I will walk through each component with visualization. But as mentioned, it is a 3-step algorithm. The first is batch data generation, where we learn we acquire a batch data set. The second is that we're going to be splitting this batch data set into different smaller data sets, 1 for each skill. And then the third step is we're going to be training a skill from each of the smaller skilled data sets. To walk through the first part of the algorithm, it itself is a 3-step process. We're going to be first sampling a new task, which can be represented by a particular context vector. Then we're going to be solving the scene and then running an algorithm called CREST to obtain the relevant variables A and D. Now, for giving you more idea for what CREST does, if there is some confusion, I do have some backup slides that I can talk about during the discussion period to walk you through. But for the time being, I did want to provide a short TLDR in what CREST is. So CREST is basically an algorithm for causal feature selection. And you can think of it in terms of inputs and outputs here on the right. So it takes in some initial context vector, and then the CREST causal feature selection algorithm then outputs a compressed context. So it is only giving us the dimensions that are considered causally relevant. And the way this works is that once we have a set of parameters that can solve that particular task, what CREST does is for each context variable at a time, one by one, what it does is it conducts interventions on that variable to see if there's then any change in reward. So the idea being, if you change something in the world and you rerun the same policy parameters and you still solve the task, this means that, okay, what I changed was probably not relevant. So for example, in this block stacking domain, this would be like, I did an intervention on a cylinder 2 states away, and I run the same parameters. Therefore, that tells me, and that still works, then that tells me that the interventions on that parameter for the cylinder don't apply and that they're not causally relevant. So what we're going to be obtaining as a result of CREST is a set of causally relevant variables. Again, if there is confusion, I do have backup slides that I can talk to at the end of the talk. So to dive a little bit more deeply, I'm going to give some illustrations of the first and second steps here. So for the first step is we're going to be creating this batch data set here. And we sample different tasks represented by context vectors, and then we solve them to obtain first a context vector and an appropriate set of policy parameters. Note here that it is possible that certain tasks can't be solved. This would be the case that the robot simply can't find a set of parameters that solves that particular task, and that is okay. All that means is that this particular data set or data point isn't appended to the batch data set. So for the illustration here, you can see each of these square data points here and the diamond data points here are each of these contexts that were sampled. Now, what I'm also doing is coloring them by the family of solutions that it belongs to. This is something that isn't known at this point in the algorithm, but for illustration purposes, I think it really helps to convey what's going on. So you can see here, I've noted these data points, the blue data points related to free block motion, and the orange data points relate to obstructing block motion, as seen here. Now, the next step is we want to obtain the relevant variables. And this is a 2-step process because there are 2 types of relevant variables we want to obtain, the A variables and the D variables. So these A variables are also referred to as local relevant variables. And the reason they're called this is because we are going to be conducting interventions around each task context in a really small part of the context space, so maybe 10%. And we're going to be doing this to find out which of these variables are relevant. For example, of the blue data points here in the bottom right, remember there are 2 variables here, the target height and the obstructing height. So if we change the target height within this range, this does affect the solution. So now the target height is a little bit taller. So if we use the same parameters, now we actually can't stack it anymore, for example. So that would tell us, yes, the target height is relevant for this data. However, for the obstructing block height, recall that this particular solution, the trajectory actually passes over the obstructing block. So for very small perturbations, we can change the obstructing block height, and this doesn't affect the solution. So what this tells us is that the obstructing block height is not relevant. So for these local relevant variables for these data, this would only give us the target block height. Now for the data that's on the upper left here, the orange data points, it's a different story. So it is the case that the interventions on target height still affect the solution. However, now we see here, if we intervene on the obstructing block height, now this starts to interfere with the solution, right? So if I make the obstructing block taller, now the robot using that same set of parameters now can't clear the block. You're going to get a decrease in the reward, and now you can't solve the task. So that would tell us that this variable is important now and relevant. So for the A variables in this set of the data set, in this case, we would have both. We would have both the target block and the obstructing block. The next step is to perform global interventions to learn what the D variables are that these will ultimately use for the DGR. And this is the same intuition as before, but instead of doing interventions across this really small space of the context, we're going to be now conducting interventions over the entire context. And so this is why we call these global interventions and globally relevant variables. And so in this case, for the data in the bottom right, it's the case that both of these variables now become relevant because for the obstructing block here, we're conducting the interventions more than just a really small perturbation around the solution. We're actually going to be testing the entire range here. So there will be cases where if this obstructing block becomes quite large, that this affects the solution. So in this case, for the blue data points, we do see here that the for these relevant variables, we have the target height and the obstructing block height. And we do get the same solution here as well for the orange data points for the obstructing block motion case. In this case, they're still also both relevant. So our global relevant variables in this case are still the target block height and the obstructing block height. So we complete this process for each data point in the batch data set. And depending on the task, like for our block stacking experiments, we use about 500 data points. For our peg insertion experiments, there were, I believe, between 100 to 200. So we perform that to finish off step one, once we have that batch data set. The second step is then from this batch data set, we then need to split it into individual data sets for each skill. And I hope the illustrations that I did before with providing certain colors to the data set, I think hopefully it's clear here why I did that. Because what we end up doing is we're going to be grouping similar results for the A variables together into their own data set. So for this particular task, we have a data set corresponding to data in the lower right-hand part of the context space pertaining to free block motion. And then we have data corresponding to, in the upper left part of the context space, for the obstructing block motion case. Now, once we have these individual data sets for each skill, the final step of scale is that we're going to be training a skill using each of the skill data sets. So this process continues for each data set. And this itself is another three-step process. It is done in this order. So the first thing we do is we train the DGR, then we train the option policy, and then we train the preconditions. So this slide talks more about step three for learning these individual skill components. So the first step is to train the DGR. And so in order to do this, we take the context vectors, and then we also take the dimensions of the context vectors specified by the D variables. So that tells us what dimensions we should use for learning the DGR. And there's this illustration here, figure on the left here, shows what that DGR looks like for each of the skills. And you can see here, it's basically a region that is, it sort of encapsulates the boundary of the skill data set. For the experiments we conducted in the paper, we used a one-class SVM to be able to learn these clusters. The second step after that is then we train the option policy. So the way we do this is first we look at our A variables. Again, these are the locally relevant variables to understand what inputs do we need for the policy. And then what we're going to do for each skill data set is we're going to pass that training data for the policy. We're going to actually filter it through the DGR to keep samples that are high quality for training the policy. And then we simply train the policy to regress to the policy parameters. Once we have the policy for each skill, then the final step is we learn the preconditions for each skill. Again, preconditions in this case, we're using our probabilistic estimates of whether the task can be completed or not from a particular place in the context. So for the precondition for skill 1, which is free block motion, looks something like this. So we see a region of high precondition surrounding the DGR. This is as expected. But note that as we get away from this region, now the probability of success drops precipitously. And so what this typically means is that we can't use the free block motion case now, because in the upper left here, these are cases for obstructing block motion. What we get is the opposite of this for precondition for skill 2. In the obstructed block motion, see here we have a region of high precondition on the upper left part of the region. And on the lower right, this no longer can solve the problem. Now, once we've trained the skill library, now we can use it for many different applications. And one of the things we can use it for is using it for solving the task or solving it for downstream tasks. For this particular problem, we can use the skill library to solve the task. And what we see here, in order to do this, we sample a new context, and then we evaluate the preconditions for all of the different skills. And we simply execute the skill with the highest precondition. And very interestingly, as I alluded to earlier, what we see here is that indeed we have this really nice partitioning in the context space for skills for free block motion being applied. This is skill 1 in the lower right, and obstructed block motion skill 2 in the upper left here. And what's really interesting is that we're able to do this with linear skill policies. This is a nonlinear problem. So if you were to do this without this type of methodology, and you just wanted to have a nonlinear neural network and train it with the data, you would need much more data, and potentially you would have to capture the nonlinear regions of this data. However, with scale, we're able to learn individual structures in the data. And then in this case, they can be solved individually with linear policies. So that's a really neat demonstration of this experiment. Now, okay, so now that I've described scale, I'm going to talk about very briefly about some of the experiments. Now, in the paper, we looked at 2 experimental domains. The first was block stacking, and the second was peg insertion under uncertainty. And for the experiments in the paper, primarily they focused on skill discovery and skill learning. And we also conducted follow-up experiments in the appendix that assessed other dimensions of this problem. So for the block stacking domain, we were able to show that the skills we learned in simulation could be transferred zero-shot to a real robot system. And so we were able to show sim-to-real transfer that way. We're also able to show that learning the skill library can be utilized for a downstream application. For example, stacking a block tower, which is a number of different tasks put together. For the peg insertion under uncertainty, besides learning and discovering the skills, we also looked into how robust the skills are to a domain shift. And we're able to show that our approaches are more robust than the baselines. Now, for the purposes of this talk and for making sure there's room for discussion, I do just want to highlight one set of experiments. After this set of experiments, I'll talk about limitations, and then that will be the end of my talk. So maybe about 3 to 4 more minutes. So the peg insertion under uncertainty domain is a sensorless problem. So the idea is the robot is holding a peg, and the task is solved when the peg can be inserted into the hole in the board here. The problem is that there is a sensorless problem. So with the robot, so if the robot simply just tries to naively force the peg downward, it only succeeds about 1/3 of the time. So what the robot needs to do is take uncertainty reducing actions by localizing against these walls here, these 4 fixtures around the experimental domain, to reduce the uncertainty, and then it can do a successful insertion. So what the video shows here is a successful insertion using a localization strategy against the top fixture. This would be skill number 2. And for the skills that were discovered by scale, we discovered 5 different skills. And 4 of them each pertain to a different and distinct localization strategy in this experiment, which is pretty neat. So the robot was able to learn a skill for localizing against the top fixture, the bottom fixture, the left fixture, and the right fixture. And it was able to do this quite successfully. It was able to solve the task about 96.48% of the time with the linear policies. And for both the linear and the nonlinear case, was able to outperform the baselines. I do want to note here that it did learn this first skill here, which was generally low performing. We thought this was interesting because this actually goes to speak to one of the limitations of our assumptions, is that we assume that the context space is disentangled. But what we actually found is that the solution it found required it to be entangled. As it ended up being the case, the skill ends up being low performing. So when it's actually used at training time, it's simply not executed because it has a low precondition. And in practice, skills 2 through 5 are the ones that are used. So this slide, before I close, I want to highlight the limitations here, very important to clarify. So as a part of our work, we do make strong assumptions. And because of that, there are some limitations that exist. I want to highlight 3 of them. The first is that the simulator that we're using has certain properties. For example, it has the capability of constructing scenes. And then if you take interventions, you can get the output of that intervention. Potentially, the causal models there could be learned from an approach, say, through causal discovery. The second is that we're going to be learning the skills from a batch data set setting. What this means is that typically the skills that are learned are going to be most statistically frequent, but we may miss skills that are useful, but are not statistically common. So potentially you could improve this approach by having active learning to discover those statistically infrequent skills. The last limitation, potentially the most important one to remember, is that we do assume that the context space is defined, it is intervenable, and it is disentangled. So if that is true for your particular task, I suspect that scale will work. But there's other interesting tasks, like with deformable, like t-shirt folding, for example. What does a disentangled context space look like there? And we don't have an answer to that yet, but I want to direct you to an area of work called causal representation learning. I think this paper is really impactful and really important to help steer the types of approaches in integrating causality into machine learning and representation learning. So potentially advancements in that area could help with applying scale to other areas. So in conclusion, what I hope to convey here is that the skills learned by scale are compact by defining only the relevant variables. They are interpretable because they're only can be explained by and encoded by the relevant variables. In the paper, we also show that there is robustness to domain shifts. The skills can be reusable, and that they're also suitable for sim-to-real transfer. So with that said, I will conclude my talk and open it up to questions, discussion. I also wanted to thank you very much for your attendance, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. And then that was great information.
My name is Charles. So I'm an undergraduate researcher, mechatronics and robotics at Kennesaw State University near Atlanta, Georgia. So I just want to know, I'm taking robosynthesis right now. I just want to know, like, what is the best way to learn kinematics, like for inverse kinematics for doing these type of algorithms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my exposure to say forward kinematics and inverse kinematics. So as a part of my program at CMU, we do have a class. Well, I have a couple classes pertaining to this. One is kinematics, dynamics, and control, and then the other is mechanics of manipulation. And there's some classical textbooks in this work. I don't remember them offhand, but if you can send me an email afterward, I can send you some references to this area. And what I did to learn is read the references and try to understand them. What really helps is making a little simulator or a little model to say the forward kinematics, if I have a certain joint angle to set to the robot, where does the end effector go? And then also being able to, with inverse kinematics, typically, well, actually, I guess for both forward and inverse kinematics. There's some really useful libraries that are can possibly be used. There's a couple of them. I've used one or two of them, and again, I can send you an email offline to direct you to those resources.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Hello, Tabitha. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Greetings from Central Europe, Bratislava. My question relates to your definition of a skill, because from the talk, I had an impression that it's considered something to be rather concrete, rather than something to be more general, which can be parameterized with certain parameters. Like, for instance, moving an arm from A to B could be considered as one skill, parameterized by the positions of the target. In your case, it seemed to me that it's meant to be something very concrete, like very specific. Can you comment on this, on your definition of a skill?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Igor. I think this is a great question because I think there is maybe a little bit of a philosophy in terms of, do you look at it more like a discrete explicit skill, or is it something more implicit to the action of the robot? And potentially different works may choose to frame it in one versus the other. For you're right insofar that in scale, what we are learning are like these discrete, explicit skills that are parameterized by the relevant variables. But there are some of the works I mentioned in the related work section speak to learning these sort of discovered skills as part of the agent's capability of moving out through the world. And so in that case, that would be more implicit. So my answer to you is I don't think one is necessarily better way of looking at the problem than the other. I think what matters is how you're going to use it. So our choice of using the sort of explicit grounding is that, so our vision and sort of contextualized within the research vision of the lab that we work in is that it is very useful to have like a robot system that can have different skills it can execute for certain things. So that sort of lends itself to that way of looking at the problem. But I want to emphasize that that's, I'm not saying that's the better way of looking at it. I'm just saying it's like a different perspective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Maybe I would have another question if there are none. So as I understand the CREST model, so we are assuming you have the access to the representation with explicitly selected features, which altogether can be potentially relevant within the task you're trying to solve. And then you identify the causally relevant features by sort of grid search method, like trial and error, to see which one is causally relevant, right? But you have this scope that you have a sort of representation vector that captures all the potential relevant features, and for whatever task you just select the subset of those. Is it my understanding correct that you do this trial and error, but when trying to identify what's relevant?
Yeah, a great question. Generally speaking, I would say that is correct. So for each of these variables, what CREST is going to be doing is conducting this. You could exactly think of it like trial and error. Like, let me try a different setting for this variable, seeing if the solution changes or not. So that sort of approach to the problem, it does require, like you're saying, the context space to be in a certain representation. So I think a really useful and interesting potential way to think about future directions, because I see someone in the chat said something about future directions, is how does that idea extend to high dimensional spaces like images, right? What are the relevant variables of an image? Are they the pixel? Are they what the picture encodes? There's a lot of interesting open work there. So I'd love to see some work in that area to tie into that vision aspect of it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
So are you taking into account some tactile feedback into the peg in the hole or any interaction task that you were doing?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Forced it.
I don't believe we are explicitly incorporating any sort of tactile feedback. And I see Shivam is on the call. He can also chime in here as well. But I believe that it is generally, as constructed, a sensorless problem. So the goal for the robot is just to take these actions to reduce the uncertainty and then be able to insert the peg from there. I do think, in general, is interesting to consider like extending this to like multiple modalities, and I think like tactile would be a good example here. Yeah, Shivam, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, so yeah, that's right. We don't use any tactile feedback. And basically the setup is that we have a map of the task, but we don't know where we are relative to that map. So essentially, if you localize against a wall, then you sort of know where you are, and then you can do the insertion. Yeah, but I think you would need some sort of tactile feedback if you're trying to do an even more high precision peg insertion, right? So peg insertion, hardness of peg insertion is on a spectrum, and the tighter the tolerance you gets, and need more sensing modalities. But we did not need it for the specific tolerance we had.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
One of the assumptions of this model is, this collection of batch data before doing the simulation. So do you think it's possible to overcome this very strong limitation of the model that would be like running on the fly, because that would make it much more ecologically valid,
Yeah, for sure. Oh, sorry, great question. Just to make sure my understanding is correct, is this the question about, is there a way to get away from this batch data generation process to it? Okay, perfect. I agree that would be very useful and impactful as well, because I can look at, say, a vision or for what we would want the robot to be able to do is like in the kitchen, in the scene, actually be able to do these interventions to probe the scene, and then be able to, from there, take this online learning and then update the skills from there. So I think this work scale could be extended in a couple of ways. I think one of the directions I would look to answer that is extending it in an active learning setting, where instead of solving, doing this process like 500 times, for example, for this, you would actually solve it one time, and then you would also probe the scene around it to say like, okay, is this the same skill? Or there's something else here. So you sort of do a more active learning approach there. I think that would be what I would look to as an extension to help with that.
Great, thanks.
Thank you for your question.
All right. Thanks again, Tabitha. That was great getting to know about your research and scale. And thanks, Shivam, for joining us as well as the other author on the paper.